What if one of the most important geopolitical transformations of the 21st century is happening right now, and almost nobody is paying attention? A country that once depended on foreign weapons for its own survival is now exporting military power across 3 continents. Its drones fly over Africa, its soldiers train foreign armies, its companies search for oil beneath contested waters. Its influence stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And yet, this is not a story most people are talking about, because unlike the great powers of the past, this country is not building an empire through conquest. It is building something far more subtle, a network of security agreements, military partnerships, infrastructure projects, energy deals, intelligence cooperation, and strategic dependencies. The country is Turkey. The official story is simple. Turkey built a successful defense industry. It developed drones, missiles, radar systems, military electronics. Other nations bought them. Exports increased. Influence followed. Case closed. At least that's what the headlines suggest. But what if the weapons are not the real story? What if the drones are only the visible layer of something much larger? Because when you begin connecting the dots, strange patterns emerge. A military base in Somalia, energy agreements in Libya, drone exports across the Sahel, growing influence in the Gulf, new security partnerships throughout Africa. At first glance, these events appear unrelated. Different governments, different regions, different crises. But viewed together, they form a map. And maps reveal things headlines cannot. The deeper you look, the more a disturbing possibility begins to emerge. What if Turkey is not simply selling weapons? What if it is building access? Access to trade routes, access to energy corridors, access to strategic geography, access to the future, because in the modern world, power rarely arrives wearing a uniform. It arrives through systems. The nation that controls critical infrastructure gains leverage. The nation that provides security gains influence. The nation that becomes indispensable gains power. And increasingly, Turkey appears to be positioning itself at the intersection of all 3. But this story did not begin with ambition. It began with vulnerability. Decades ago, Turkey learned a painful lesson, a lesson that changed the way its leaders viewed sovereignty forever. The realization that military strength means very little if someone else controls the supply chain. That realization triggered a transformation, one that would take generations to complete. Factories were built, institutions were created, engineers were trained, technologies were developed, an entire ecosystem emerged. At first, the goal was independence, but over time, independence evolved into something else, influence. And influence evolved into leverage. Today, Turkish drones have become symbols of a new era of warfare. Turkish defense companies compete with some of the world's most established manufacturers. Turkish military partnerships are reshaping relationships across Africa and the Middle East. And Turkish ambitions are expanding into areas once dominated by global powers. Supporters see a nation finally reclaiming strategic autonomy. Critics see an emerging regional power pursuing influence under a different name. Both sides agree on one thing. Something significant is happening. The question is what it means. Is Turkey creating a new model of geopolitical influence? A model built not on occupation, but on integration, not on direct control, but on strategic dependency, not on empire, but on networks? And if so, now what happens when those networks continue to expand? Because the story you are about to hear is not just about Turkey. It is about the future of power itself. A future where influence is quieter, more connected, more difficult to detect, and potentially more powerful than ever before. This is the story of how a nation transformed dependency into leverage, leverage into influence, and influence into a growing geopolitical network stretching across some of the most important regions on Earth. This is the story of the silent hegemon. Every nation's foreign policy is shaped by a defining trauma, a moment when reality shatters assumptions, a moment when leaders discover what power truly means. For modern Turkey, that moment arrived in 1974. At the time, Turkey was already a major military force within NATO. Its strategic location made it one of the alliance's most important members. Sitting between Europe, the Middle East, the Black Sea, and the Soviet Union, Turkey occupied one of the most valuable geopolitical positions on Earth. On paper, it looked strong. Its military possessed aircraft, armored vehicles, advanced weapons, Western technology. The country appeared secure, but appearances can be deceptive. Because Turkey possessed weapons, yet it did not fully control them. The distinction would prove critical. In 1974, following Turkey's military intervention in Cyprus, relations with Washington deteriorated rapidly. What followed was not a battlefield defeat. It was something far more unsettling, an arms embargo. Almost overnight, Turkish policymakers confronted a reality they had never fully appreciated. Modern military power is not simply about owning equipment. It is about controlling the systems behind the equipment. Aircraft require spare parts, weapons require maintenance, electronics require support, supply chains require political approval. And when those supply chains belong to someone else, military strength becomes conditional. The consequences were immediate. Programs slowed. Capabilities were restricted, dependencies became visible. What had previously seemed like a strategic partnership suddenly revealed another dimension: reliance. For many Turkish decision-makers, the embargo was more than a diplomatic dispute. It was a warning, a glimpse into a future where national security could be constrained by foreign political decisions. And once that realization takes hold, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because sovereignty is not merely the ability to make decisions, it is the ability to act on those decisions without permission, without approval, without external dependence. The experience left a deep mark on an entire generation of military planners, engineers, and policymakers. The lesson was simple. If Turkey wanted genuine strategic autonomy, it could not rely indefinitely on foreign defense systems. It had to build its own. Not just individual weapons, an ecosystem. At first, the challenge seemed overwhelming. Developing military technology is among the most difficult tasks any nation can undertake. It requires money, expertise, research institutions, industrial capacity, long-term planning. Most importantly, it requires patience. Years of patience, sometimes decades. Yet Turkey began laying the foundations anyway. New institutions emerged, research organizations were established, defense companies received support, engineers were trained. Domestic production gradually expanded. The process was slow, painfully slow. There were setbacks, failures, budget constraints, technological limitations. For years, few outside observers paid much attention. Turkey was still viewed primarily as a customer in the global defense market, a buyer, not a builder. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Every new project added experience, every challenge produced expertise, every failure became a lesson. The objective was never simply to manufacture equipment. The objective was to eliminate vulnerability, to ensure that no future embargo could place national security at risk. And over time, that objective evolved into something much larger. Because once a country learns how to build military technology for itself, a new possibility emerges. If you can supply your own military, you can eventually supply others. That idea would transform everything. What began as a search for independence would gradually become an instrument of influence. Factories designed to protect sovereignty would eventually produce exports. Exports would create partnerships. Partnerships would create leverage, and leverage would open doors far beyond Turkey's borders. But none of that was visible yet. In the decades following the embargo, the project remained largely hidden from international attention. Quiet, technical, unremarkable. The world was watching superpowers. Turkey was building infrastructure. And infrastructure has a peculiar characteristic. It accumulates power silently, year after year, layer after layer, until one day the results become impossible to ignore. By the early 21st century, that moment was approaching. A new generation of companies was emerging, a new generation of engineers was taking control, and a new vision was beginning to form. The goal was no longer merely self-sufficiency. The goal was competitiveness. And once that transition occurred, Turkey's defense industry would enter a completely new phase. A phase that would eventually place its technologies on battlefields thousands of kilometers away from home. Most revolutions announce themselves. This one did not. There were no dramatic speeches, no historic declarations, no moment when the world suddenly realized what was happening. Instead, the transformation unfolded quietly. Inside laboratories, research centers, engineering departments, production facilities, places rarely featured on the evening news. Yet these were the places where Turkey's future was being built. Because after the lessons of the 1970s, Turkish policymakers understood something fundamental. Dependence could not be solved with a single weapons program, or a single company, or a single government initiative. The problem was systemic, which meant the solution had to be systemic as well. Turkey did not simply need military equipment. It needed an ecosystem capable of designing, manufacturing, upgrading, and sustaining critical technologies without relying entirely on foreign suppliers. That objective would shape the next several decades. Gradually, institutions emerged to support the effort. Investment increased. Research expanded. Universities became more connected to industry. Engineers gained opportunities that had barely existed a generation earlier. The process was slow, sometimes frustratingly slow, but progress was accumulating, and then came a critical realization. State institutions alone would not be enough. Innovation rarely thrives inside rigid structures. The modern technology race rewards speed, experimentation, adaptation, the ability to fail quickly and improve even faster. Turkey needed private sector innovators, companies willing to take risks, companies willing to challenge established assumptions, companies capable of competing globally. And that is precisely what began to emerge. One by one, new players entered the field. Some focused on electronics, others on missiles, others on aerospace technologies. Together, they formed the foundation of a rapidly expanding defense industrial network. Among them was a company that would eventually become one of the most recognized names in modern warfare, Baykar. Today, the name is known across continents, but its rise was anything but inevitable. In its early years, few outside defense circles paid much attention. The global military market was dominated by giants, American firms, European manufacturers, Russian exporters. Against such competition, a Turkish drone company appeared unlikely to change the balance. Yet Baykar was approaching the problem differently. Instead of focusing on traditional military platforms, it focused on a technology many still underestimated: unmanned systems. At the time, drones were often viewed as supporting tools. Useful, important, but secondary. The future, many believed, still belonged to manned aircraft. That assumption would not survive the next decade. While others debated the future, Turkish engineers were building for it, testing, improving, iterating, learning from every success and every failure. The result was not merely a drone, it was a philosophy: affordable systems, operational flexibility, rapid deployment, continuous adaptation, characteristics perfectly suited for the changing nature of modern conflict. Yet Baykar was only one piece of the puzzle. Because drones alone do not create military power. A drone requires sensors, communication systems, targeting technologies, electronic warfare capabilities, software, data links, precision-guided munitions. Remove any of these components and the system becomes dramatically less effective. This is where another giant entered the picture: ASELSAN. If Baykar became the face of Turkey's defense transformation, ASELSAN became its nervous system. Modern warfare increasingly depends on information. Who sees first? Who communicates first? Who understands the battlefield first? Victory often belongs to the side that processes information faster than its opponent. ASELSAN specialized in exactly those capabilities: radar systems, military communications, electronic warfare, surveillance technologies, command and control networks, the invisible infrastructure that turns hardware into capability. Its technologies became embedded throughout Turkey's military modernization effort, connecting platforms, improving awareness, expanding operational reach. At the same time, another key player was advancing rapidly: Roketsan. Focused on missiles and precision munitions, the company addressed another critical vulnerability, because possessing advanced platforms means little if the weapons themselves remain dependent on foreign suppliers. Turkey needed domestic solutions, and Roketsan became one of the primary engines driving that effort. Missiles, rocket systems, guided munitions, capabilities that increasingly complemented the country's growing defense ecosystem. What made this transformation remarkable was not any individual company. It was the integration between them. Each organization strengthened the others. Each new capability reduced dependency. Each technological breakthrough created opportunities elsewhere. Together, they formed something far more valuable than a collection of manufacturers. They formed a network. And networks generate resilience. A failed component does not destroy the system. The system adapts, improves, continues evolving. By the 2010s, the results were becoming increasingly visible. Turkish defense products were no longer serving only domestic needs. International interest was growing. Foreign governments were paying attention. Military observers were paying attention. Competitors were paying attention because something unexpected was happening. The technologies created to protect Turkey from dependence were beginning to attract customers around the world. And once foreign governments started buying those technologies, the entire equation changed. Turkey was no longer simply building autonomy, it was exporting it. And with every export came something far more valuable than revenue: influence. For decades, Turkey's defense transformation remained largely invisible. Engineers noticed, military analysts noticed, industry insiders noticed, but the wider world did not. Then the battlefield changed. And suddenly everyone was paying attention, because military technologies can spend years in development, years in testing, years in demonstrations, yet their true reputation is forged elsewhere, in conflict, under pressure, against real opponents. And by the late 2010s, Turkish systems were entering exactly those environments. What followed would dramatically alter global perceptions. The turning point was not a single war. It was a series of conflicts, different countries, different circumstances, different enemies. Yet the same technologies kept appearing. And the results were difficult to ignore. For decades, military power had often been associated with expensive platforms: advanced fighter aircraft, large armoured formations, massive defence budgets. The assumption seemed obvious. The more money a country spent, the stronger its military capabilities would be. But the emergence of modern drone warfare challenged that assumption. A relatively inexpensive unmanned aircraft could now identify targets, track movements, provide intelligence, and in some cases, conduct precision strikes, capabilities once associated with far more expensive systems. Suddenly, smaller nations had options they never possessed before, and Turkey happened to be producing exactly the type of systems many countries needed. The Bayraktar TB2 became the symbol of this shift. Videos of successful operations spread across social media. Military observers analysed the footage. Governments studied the results. Defence ministries began asking difficult questions. Had the economics of warfare changed? Could affordable unmanned systems achieve effects once reserved for much larger military powers? The debate intensified with every new conflict. And with every conflict, Turkish technology received something no marketing campaign could ever buy: visibility. The battlefield had become a showroom. Potential customers were no longer reading brochures. They were watching real-world performance. That distinction changed everything. Defense exports began accelerating, new contracts appeared, new partnerships emerged. Governments that previously ignored Turkish defense products started requesting meetings. Military delegations arrived, negotiations expanded, the market was responding. But something else was happening at the same time, something less obvious, because countries were not merely buying drones, they were buying access to an entire ecosystem. A drone is not a self-contained product. It requires training, maintenance, software support, operational doctrine, replacement parts, technical expertise. The sale marks the beginning of a relationship, not the end. And relationships create influence. Consider the difference between selling a truck and selling an integrated military system. A truck can operate independently. A military ecosystem cannot. The customer becomes connected to instructors, engineers, manufacturers, logistics networks, supply chains. Over time, those connections deepen, trust develops, communication increases, institutional familiarity grows, the relationship becomes strategic. This dynamic helps explain why Turkish defense exports became so important. Revenue was certainly valuable, industrial growth was certainly valuable, but the greatest asset being created may have been something else entirely. Long-term geopolitical relationships. Relationships extending far beyond the battlefield, because military cooperation often opens doors that ordinary diplomacy cannot. Defense officials become familiar with one another. Military academies exchange expertise. Governments coordinate security priorities. Intelligence cooperation becomes easier. Economic partnerships become more likely. What begins as a procurement decision can gradually evolve into something much larger. And this pattern was becoming increasingly visible, especially in Africa. Across the continent, governments faced a difficult challenge: insurgencies, border insecurity, terrorism, weak institutional capacity. At the same time, many were growing frustrated with traditional security arrangements. Some viewed Western partnerships as overly restrictive. Others questioned the reliability of alternative providers. Turkey entered this environment with a different offer: military capability, rapid delivery, operational flexibility, and a narrative centered on sovereignty. The message resonated, contracts followed, then training missions, then broader cooperation. Again and again, the same sequence appeared: security first, partnership second, influence third. The deeper analysts looked, the more a larger pattern began to emerge. Turkish systems were appearing in regions of enormous strategic importance: the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, North Africa, the Gulf. Not one region, multiple regions simultaneously. And that raised a fascinating question. Was Turkey simply following market demand, or was something more deliberate taking shape? Because when all the agreements were plotted on a map, they formed something remarkable. A network stretching across critical trade routes, energy corridors, maritime choke points, and resource-rich territories. The pattern was becoming difficult to dismiss. The drones were attracting attention, but the geography was telling the real story. And nowhere would that story become clearer than in Somalia, because Somalia would reveal that the export of security could become something far more valuable than the sale of weapons. It could become a gateway to influence itself. If drones were the tool, Somalia was the proof of concept, because Somalia reveals something that cannot be seen by looking at weapons sales alone. It reveals the architecture behind the strategy. To understand why, look at a map, not a political map, a trade map. A map showing the movement of energy, shipping, and global commerce. Immediately, one location stands out: the Horn of Africa, a region positioned beside one of the most important maritime corridors on Earth. Every year, enormous volumes of global trade move through nearby waters: oil tankers, container ships, strategic resources, supply chains connecting Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. For centuries, major powers have competed for influence near these routes, because whoever helps secure critical corridors gains leverage over global commerce. Somalia sits directly beside one of those corridors. Yet for decades, Somalia was known for entirely different reasons: civil war, piracy, political instability, weak institutions, humanitarian crises. Most outside powers viewed the country through the lens of risk. Turkey saw something else: opportunity, not in the traditional sense, not conquest, not occupation, but long-term engagement. The modern relationship began with humanitarian assistance. Hospitals were built, infrastructure projects expanded, educational initiatives appeared, diplomatic engagement increased. Unlike many foreign actors, Turkey maintained a visible presence on the ground. And that visibility mattered. Because influence rarely begins with military agreements. It begins with trust. Trust creates relationships. Relationships create access. Access creates opportunity. Over time, cooperation deepened. Humanitarian engagement evolved into strategic partnership. Economic cooperation expanded. Political connections strengthened. Then came a development that attracted far less attention than it deserved. Military integration. Turkey established a major training facility in Mogadishu. Thousands of Somali personnel would eventually pass through its programs. New capabilities were developed. Military structures were strengthened. Professional networks emerged. On the surface, the arrangement seemed straightforward. Somalia required security assistance. Turkey provided it. A mutually beneficial partnership. But there was a deeper layer, because security is rarely an isolated service. Security creates stability, and stability unlocks possibilities. Investment becomes easier. Infrastructure becomes viable. Resource development becomes practical. Economic activity expands. In many ways, security functions as the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, opportunities remain theoretical. With it, they become accessible. This is where the Somalia story becomes particularly revealing, because in recent years, cooperation expanded beyond traditional defense agreements. Attention increasingly shifted toward maritime security. And maritime security means something very specific in a place like Somalia. It means protecting fishing resources, protecting shipping routes, protecting offshore economic activity, protecting future energy development. In other words, protecting value. Suddenly, military cooperation was no longer only about defense. It was becoming connected to economics, to resources, to long-term strategic interests. The relationship was evolving into something more integrated, a model where security and economic opportunity reinforced one another. And once you recognize that model, it becomes difficult to ignore elsewhere, because similar dynamics begin appearing across multiple regions. Security partnerships create stability. Stability encourages investment. Investment strengthens relationships. Relationships expand influence. The cycle repeats again and again. Somalia simply makes the pattern easier to see. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Turkey is not operating like a traditional superpower. Historically, great powers often projected influence through direct control. Military occupations, colonial administrations, permanent dominance. The Turkish approach appears different, less visible, more networked. Rather than controlling territory, it seeks to become embedded within systems, security systems, economic systems, infrastructure systems, institutional systems, systems that continue functioning long after individual governments change. And systems are extraordinarily powerful, because once a nation becomes integrated into a country's security architecture, replacing it becomes difficult. Once relationships mature, alternatives become costly. Once networks are established, influence acquires momentum. The result is a form of power that doesn't always look like power. There are no imperial flags, no formal colonies, no dramatic declarations, yet influence expands anyway. Quietly, gradually, systematically. Somalia may therefore represent more than a successful partnership. It may represent a blueprint, a model showing how military capability can be converted into strategic access, how access can become influence, and how influence can eventually reshape entire regions, because Somalia is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. The same logic would soon appear elsewhere, across North Africa, across the Sahel, across resource-rich territories stretching thousands of kilometers beyond Somalia's borders. And when those locations are connected together, a much larger picture begins to emerge. A picture not of isolated partnerships, but of an expanding geopolitical corridor. At first glance, Somalia appears to be a unique case. A special partnership. A one-off relationship shaped by unusual circumstances. But when analysts began examining Turkey's activities across a much larger map, an unexpected pattern emerged. The same logic seemed to appear again, and again, and again. Different countries, different governments, different crises, yet remarkably similar outcomes. Security cooperation first, economic opportunities second, strategic influence third. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Nowhere was this more visible than Libya. For more than a decade, Libya has been one of the most contested countries in the world. Civil war, foreign intervention, competing factions, competing governments, competing visions of the future. Yet beneath the political chaos lies something of enormous value: energy. Libya possesses some of the largest oil reserves in Africa. Its coastline stretches across the Mediterranean. Its geographic position connects Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In geopolitical terms, Libya is not simply a country, it is a crossroads. When Turkey intervened in support of the internationally recognized government in Tripoli, global attention focused primarily on the military dimension: drones, military advisors, air defense systems, battlefield outcomes. Those were the visible headlines. But over time, another story began to develop. A quieter story. One involving maritime agreements, energy exploration, economic cooperation, strategic access. The military relationship created conditions for broader engagement, and broader engagement created opportunities that extended far beyond the battlefield. The same sequence appeared once again: security, partnership, access, influence. Then there was the Sahel, a vast region stretching across Africa from west to east, often described through the language of instability, terrorism, insurgencies, political upheaval, military coups. Yet beneath those headlines lies another reality: resources, gold, uranium, critical minerals, strategic commodities increasingly important in the modern economy. Historically, major powers competed for influence in the region because of these resources. Some arrived through military deployments, others through economic investments, others through historical relationships dating back decades. But the geopolitical landscape was changing. Old powers were losing influence, vacuums were emerging, and vacuums rarely remain empty for long. Turkey saw an opportunity, not necessarily to replace anyone, but to establish a presence. Defense agreements expanded, training partnerships increased, military cooperation deepened, and as relationships matured, discussions often moved beyond security. Toward infrastructure, toward trade, toward economic development, toward resource cooperation. Again, the pattern repeated. The same architecture, the same sequence, the same strategic logic. Viewed individually, each agreement seemed reasonable. Viewed collectively, they revealed something larger. A corridor, not a formal corridor marked by borders. A geopolitical corridor, a chain of relationships connecting strategically important regions. From the Mediterranean to North Africa, to the Sahel, to the Horn of Africa, and beyond. The significance of this network becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of geography. For centuries, geography determined power. Control the mountains, control the rivers, control the ports, control the trade routes, control the wealth. That logic has never disappeared. It has simply evolved. Today, influence often depends on access rather than ownership. You do not necessarily need to control a port. You need access to it. You do not necessarily need to own resources. You need participation in the systems that develop them. You do not necessarily need direct authority. You need strategic relevance. And relevance can be incredibly powerful because relevance creates dependency. The more valuable your role becomes, the harder you become to replace. This may be one of the most important dimensions of Turkey's strategy. Not domination, indispensability, the ability to become a preferred partner across multiple regions simultaneously, a nation that governments call when they need security assistance, a nation that companies approach when opportunities emerge, a nation whose absence would create problems. That is a very different form of power from the empires of the past. Yet in some ways it may be more sustainable. Empires require constant control. Networks require constant maintenance. The difference is subtle, but significant. And the larger the network grows, the more valuable its connections become. Because every new relationship strengthens existing ones. Every new agreement expands options. Every new partnership increases influence. By the early 2020s, Turkey was no longer simply exporting military equipment. It was exporting relationships. Relationships capable of connecting continents. Relationships capable of opening markets. Relationships capable of shaping strategic outcomes. But there was another layer beneath all of this. A layer most people never see. The invisible infrastructure supporting the entire system. The intelligence networks, the development agencies, the cultural institutions, the diplomatic channels, the organizations quietly building trust long before defense agreements are signed, because military power alone cannot sustain influence. For that, something deeper is required, a network of human relationships, and that network may be the most powerful asset of all. Most people think influence begins with military power. History suggests otherwise because weapons can create opportunities, but they rarely create trust, and trust is the foundation upon which lasting influence is built. This is why some of history's most successful powers relied on far more than armies. They built institutions, networks, relationships, systems capable of outlasting wars, governments, and political crises. When examining Turkey's growing presence across Africa and the Middle East, a similar pattern begins to emerge. Behind every defense agreement exists another layer, a quieter layer, one that rarely appears in headlines because military cooperation is often the visible result of relationships built years earlier. Relationships created through diplomacy, development projects, intelligence cooperation, educational programs, humanitarian engagement. The public usually sees the contract, rarely the process that produced it, and that process matters, because influence is not simply acquired, it is cultivated over time, one relationship at a time, one institution at a time, one partnership at a time. Across Africa, Turkish-backed hospitals, schools, infrastructure projects and development initiatives have expanded significantly over the past 2 decades. To many communities, these projects represent practical assistance, healthcare, education, technical support, economic opportunity, and in many cases, that is exactly what they are. Yet development projects also create something less tangible: familiarity, trust, goodwill, the foundations of long-term relationships. People tend to cooperate with those they know. Governments tend to work with partners they trust, and trust becomes increasingly valuable in regions where geopolitical competition is intensifying. This is one reason influence often begins long before any defense agreement is signed, because by the time military cooperation becomes public, the relationship itself may already be years old. The same dynamic applies to diplomacy. Many countries approach international relations through ideological frameworks. Turkey often presents something different: pragmatism, a willingness to engage with diverse political systems, diverse governments, diverse regional actors. Whether in Africa, the Gulf, Central Asia, or the Middle East, the message is frequently similar: partnership rather than alignment, cooperation rather than dependency. For many governments, this approach is attractive, particularly in a world where strategic flexibility is becoming increasingly important, because modern states rarely want only one partner. They want options, they want leverage, they want room to maneuver. Turkey positions itself as one of those options. But perhaps the most overlooked dimension of all is intelligence, not espionage in the cinematic sense, not secret agents, not dramatic operations, intelligence in its broader geopolitical role, the management of information, relationships, access, communication. In unstable regions, governments often value partners capable of maintaining dialogue across multiple actors simultaneously. Partners who understand local dynamics. Partners who can help navigate complex environments. Over time, these connections create networks. Networks that often become invisible sources of influence. Networks are powerful because they multiply opportunities. A single relationship may have limited value. 1,000 interconnected relationships can reshape entire regions. This is where the story becomes especially interesting. Because beneath the military exports, beneath the economic agreements and beneath the infrastructure projects, there appears to be a larger idea driving everything. An idea rooted in Turkey's own historical experience, the belief that sovereignty matters, the belief that nations should possess the ability to make strategic decisions independently, the belief that dependence carries risks. This message resonates far beyond Turkey, especially in countries with histories of colonialism, foreign intervention, external pressure, or economic dependency. Whether one agrees with the message or not is almost irrelevant. What matters is that the message travels, and ideas that travel can become powerful. In some ways, Turkey is exporting more than technology, more than security, more than investment. It is exporting a narrative of strategic autonomy, a narrative suggesting that countries do not necessarily need to choose between major powers, that alternative paths may exist, that influence can be diversified, that sovereignty can be strengthened. For many governments, this narrative is appealing, perhaps because it reflects a broader shift taking place across the international system, a shift away from rigid blocks, toward a more complex world, a world where middle powers matter, a world where influence is increasingly distributed, a world where countries seek flexibility rather than permanent alignment. And that brings us to the final question. If Turkey's rise is not merely about drones, if it is not merely about defense exports, if it is not merely about economic access, then what exactly are we witnessing? A regional power expanding its reach, a new model of geopolitical influence, or the emergence of something much larger? Because when all the pieces are placed together, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Turkey is no longer simply reacting to the international system, it is actively attempting to shape it, and the consequences of that ambition may define the next chapter of its story. The greatest question facing Turkey today is no longer whether it can build influence. The evidence is already visible. The real question is whether it can sustain it, because history is filled with rising powers. Far fewer managed to remain influential once the environment around them changed. Success creates expectations. Expectations create obligations, and obligations create risks. The larger Turkey's network becomes, the more complex it becomes to manage. Yet despite those challenges, Ankara continues investing heavily in the future. Not the future of diplomacy, not the future of trade, the future of power itself. Because another transformation is underway. One potentially as significant as the Industrial Revolution. The nature of warfare is changing. Again. For centuries, military power was measured by manpower, the size of an army, the number of ships, the quantity of weapons. Then came industrial warfare, then mechanized warfare, then information warfare. Now a new era is emerging. Autonomous warfare, artificial intelligence, machine-assisted decision-making, networked battlefields, systems capable of processing information faster than any human commander. The countries that adapt first may gain enormous advantages, and Turkey is positioning itself to be one of them. Consider Kızılelma. For decades, drones were viewed primarily as support assets, useful for surveillance, useful for reconnaissance, useful for limited strike missions. But Kızılelma represents a different vision, a future where unmanned systems are not supporting actors. They are central actors, fast, autonomous, highly adaptable, capable of operating in environments once reserved for advanced fighter aircraft. Whether this vision ultimately succeeds remains uncertain. But its significance is impossible to ignore because it reflects a broader trend shaping militaries around the world: the gradual shift from human-centered warfare to machine-enhanced warfare. And Turkey intends to be part of that shift from the beginning. The same ambition can be seen in another project, KAAN, perhaps the most symbolic defense program in modern Turkish history. Developing a next-generation fighter aircraft is among the most difficult challenges any country can undertake. It requires advanced engineering, advanced manufacturing, advanced software, advanced logistics, and above all, an advanced industrial ecosystem. Success would place Turkey within a very small group of nations capable of designing and producing sophisticated combat aircraft largely on their own terms. Failure would reveal the limits of ambition. The stakes are enormous because KAAN is about more than aviation. It is about technological sovereignty, a demonstration that Turkey intends to compete at the highest levels of defense innovation. Yet air power is only one dimension of the future battlefield. The skies themselves are becoming increasingly crowded. Drones, cruise missiles, precision-guided weapons, hypersonic systems, electronic warfare platforms. The challenge is no longer simply attacking, the challenge is defending. This is where another concept enters the story: the steel dome. A vision of integrated defense, sensors connected to sensors, radars connected to command systems, missiles connected to artificial intelligence. A network designed to identify threats, share information, and respond with unprecedented speed. The logic is straightforward. The future battlefield will belong to the side that understands its environment first, the side that can connect information faster, the side that can make decisions faster. Integration becomes power. And power increasingly becomes digital. But technology alone will not determine the future. Economics matter, education matters, innovation matters, the ability to attract and retain talent matters. Every major technological power in history relied on something deeper than machines. People, engineers, scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs. The individuals capable of turning ideas into reality. Turkey's future influence may depend as much on these people as on any drone or fighter aircraft, because power ultimately emerges from human capability, not hardware alone. And that brings us to the final uncertainty: the future itself. Several paths remain possible. One future sees Turkey successfully expanding its network. Its defense sector grows, its partnerships deepen, its technological capabilities mature. In this scenario, Turkey becomes one of the defining middle powers of the 21st century, a state capable of shaping events across multiple regions simultaneously. Another future is less optimistic. Economic pressures intensify. Regional instability grows. Strategic commitments become difficult to sustain. Influence expands faster than resources. History has seen this pattern before. Expansion creates vulnerabilities. Success creates burdens. A third future lies somewhere in between. Turkey remains influential, but as part of a larger network of emerging powers, neither dominant nor dependent. A balancing actor in an increasingly multipolar world. Which future will emerge? No one knows, because history is not a machine. It is a series of choices. Choices made by leaders, institutions, societies, and millions of individuals whose decisions shape outcomes in ways no strategist can fully predict. But one thing is already clear. The Turkey of today is not the Turkey that faced an arms embargo half a century ago. The transformation is real. The consequences are unfolding. And whether admired, criticized, or debated, it is reshaping the geopolitical landscape around it. The only question that remains is how far that transformation will ultimately go. In the end, this was never really a story about drones. It was never really a story about missiles or military bases or defense contracts. Those were simply the visible pieces. The deeper story has always been about something far older: the pursuit of autonomy. Because every nation faces the same fundamental question: can it shape its own future, or will its future be shaped by someone else? For much of modern history, power was measured through territory. The larger the empire, the greater the influence. The The more land controlled, the stronger the state. But the 21st century is rewriting those rules. Today, power flows through networks, through trade routes, through data, through energy, through infrastructure, through relationships. The nations that understand these networks gain leverage. The nations that build them gain influence. And the nations that become indispensable gain power. This is why Turkey's transformation matters. Not because it has become a superpower, not because it controls vast territories, but because it represents something new. A country attempting to convert strategic autonomy into geopolitical relevance. A country that learned the dangers of dependence and spent decades building alternatives. What began as a response to vulnerability became an industrial ecosystem. That ecosystem became a defense sector. The defense sector became a diplomatic tool. The diplomatic tool became a network. And the network became influence. Whether that influence continues to grow remains uncertain. History offers no guarantees. Every rising power eventually encounters resistance. Every expanding network eventually faces pressure. Every strategic success creates new challenges. The future may strengthen Turkey's position or expose its limitations, perhaps both. But regardless of what happens next, one fact is already difficult to deny. The geopolitical map around Turkey is changing, not through conquest, not through occupation, not through the methods that shaped previous centuries, but through partnerships, technology, access, and strategic relationships, quietly, patiently, systematically. And perhaps that is why so many observers initially missed it, because the most important shifts in history rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with a declaration, they do not begin with a ceremony. They emerge gradually, one decision at a time, one relationship at a time, one generation at a time, until suddenly the world looks different. And everyone starts asking the same question: when did this happen? But by then, the transformation is already complete. The silent hegemon is not a story about what Turkey is today. It is a story about how power itself is evolving, less visible, more connected, more adaptable, and perhaps more influential than ever before. Because in the modern world, the strongest force is not always the one that moves the fastest, or speaks the loudest, or possesses the largest army. Sometimes it is the one building the network while everyone else is watching the headlines. And when the world finally notices, the future has already arrived.